So, good day. I am Jessa B. Linares, BSCREAM second year student of Negros Oriental State University, and I'll be reporting about the institutional correction. And my instructor is Mrs. Jilros Ador. So, the lesson one is institutional based correction. Topic to be discussed: the global view on prison administration, prison antiquity to modernity, the influence of the Roman Catholic Church, then Pope John Paul, the pro-life Pope, and the Walnut Street Jail, and King Henry the VIII, and King Edward the VI, Jewel King of Henry the VIII. The history of prison. From the birth of modern civilization in 3rd millennia BC, almost every major ancient civilization used concept of prison. In those early periods of history, prisons were often used as a temporary stopgap before sentencing to death or life of slavery, but as time went on and our civilization developed, prisons started morphing into correctional facilities that started implementing the concept of rehabilitation and reform of prisons or prisoners. So at those time, in those early years, some of the sentencing is death or life of slavery. So slaves, a criminal or a offender will be a slaves, or they also sentenced to death. In addition of holding convicted or suspected criminals, prisons were often used for holding political prisoners, enemies of the state, and prisoners of war. So in those early years, the criminals also one of the be they are being used for the war. So they are the one who face the war of their country, and also they also used for holding political prisoners. The earliest records of prisons come from the first millennia BC, located in the areas of mighty ancient civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt. During those times, prisons were almost always stationed in the underground dungeons where guilty or suspected criminals spent their life either waiting death sentence or a command to become slaves, often working as galley slaves. So in first millennia BC, there were a earliest records of prisons, which is located at the area of Mesopotamia and Egypt. So during those times, the prisons were stationed in the underground dongons. So underground dongons will be discussed later on. So what is that? So and also they were stayed there for so that they can wait if there be receive a death sentence or they will become slaves. So exception from that rule comes from the home of modern democracy. So where is the home of modern democracy? That is in Greece. Then their prisoners were held in the poorly isolated buildings where they could often be visited by their friends and family. Primary source of their detention were not dongons, high walls or bars, but simple wooden blocks that were attached to their feet. So at the prisoners in the home of modern democracy were isolated in a buildings. Then that buildings were simply wooden blocks and they were attached to their feet. In ancient Roman Empire, however, continued to use harsher methods. Their prisons were built almost exclusively underground, with tight and claustrophobic passageway and cell. So, in ancient Roman Empire, they use harsher method, and they also built and exclusively underground, so with tight and claustrophobic passageway and cell. And prisoners themselves were held either in simple cells or chained to the walls for life or for time. So at this time, prisoners are chained to the wall. So kanang by the use of the kadena, and maybe it's for life or for time because they were being used as a slaves, or they will be sentenced to death. And as slavery was accepted norm in those days, majority of prisoners that were not sentenced to death were sold as slaves or used by the Roman government as workforce. Muna siya. So they were used as a workforce or as slaves, or they were sent to fight a war, and that's it. So one of the most famous uses for the slaves in Roman Empire was an gladiator. So in addition to fighting in the arena, sometimes after lifetime of training in the special gladiator training houses or luduses, many slaves were tasked as a support workforce that enabled to smoother run of the popular gladiator businesses. So gladiators, they are the one who fight in the arena, and they also have their training, and some of the special gladiators have their special training also for them to fight and win the fight. So this is the image of the gladiators in the ancient times. So they were fighting, their they have their shield, and they're used in fighting. So they have the death at the back. So the most famous gladiator battleground, the mighty Colosseum Arena in Rome. So the mighty Colosseum Arena in Rome, this is one of the most famous gladiator battleground. It had a slave army of 224 slaves that worked daily as a power source of the complicated network of 24 elevators that transported gladiators and their wild animals opponents from the underground dungeons to the arena floor. So some of, some of us seen also the movie that we can see like this, right? That there were animals opponents that will be from the underground dunes that will be sent to the arena floor, and then the fighter or the prisoners will fight for it. So this one is the example of the fight, and it is the example also of the they where the famous gladiators battleground. So it is the image that is example for that. The condition in the European prisons remained harsh until English royalty started being more involved with their justice system. Henry II commissioned the construction of first prison in 1166, together with the first draft of English legal system that used concept of jury. One of the most historic prison legislation was introduced in 1215 when King John signed Magna Carta, which stated that no man could be imprisoned without trial. So at this time, which is 1215, when King John signed Magna Carta, there will be no man that will be in prison without trial. So at this time, the prison is happening na gyud. What I mean is trial, so due process na nahitabo na ani mga panahon na. With the rise of the industry between 16th and 18th century, English prisons became overcrowded and new penal measures started being implemented. Military pardon and penal transportation During the end of 18th century, over 50,000 prisoners were transported from England to penal colonies in North America and Australia. France even continued their practice of penal colonies until the middle of 20th century, most notably in French Guiana, and its infamous prison Devil's Island. So, in 18th century, prisons became so there were more prisoners in the 18th century. So, the military pardon and penal transportation being implemented. And in France, there will be a Devil's Island that will be the place where infamous this is the infamous prison. So what is this Devil's Island? So this is the Devil's Island wherein the people are being hungry and die due to the disease that there's no care and there's no food in this place. Okay, this is from 1852 to 1953. The inmates of in famous Devil's Island penal colony in the Caribbean died in massive from malnutrition. So this is due to the lack of supply of food, disease, and fetal escape attempts. So they tried to escape from that island for them to survive and for them to go back to their family. But some of them died and some of them also survived. So Devil's Island, also called Île du Diablo, is one of French Guiana's Îles du Salut or Salvation Islands. At first glance, Devil's Island looks like paradise. Dotted with palm trees and surrounded by sparkling waters, its beauty belies a horrific truth. For nearly 100 years, tens of thousands of men perished on its shores while living in a French penal colony. From 1852 to 1953, so this is the time that Devil's Islands, which actually encompasses three islands of the coast of French Guiana and a slice of Cayenne, housed French prisoners. Their crime ranged from offending Napoleon III to murder. But some, like French soldier Alfred Dreyfus, hadn't done anything at all. So Alfred Dreyfus was sent there even though he doesn't do anything. He doesn't done anything. And nevertheless, they all suffered equally. So whoever sent there will suffer from malnutrition, disease, and feral feral escape attempts. So few ever returned to France. So some of them escaped, but few rigid ang nakasurvive. This is the story of Devil's Island, one of the world's most brutal penal colonies. So, ano siya mo one of the brutal penal colonies in the world, which is Devil's Island. So, Russia also used remote penal colonies in the frozen northeast Siberia. The age of modern prisons that we know today started with the several prison reform reforms in 19th century England. During that time, prisoners started receiving more care, concept of rehabilitation was introduced, and government around the world, especially in the UK and US, started considering their views on solitary confinement, which was primary source of the increased number of insane suicidal and Catholic prisoners. So at the time of 19th century, which is the age of modern prison, there will be at this time prisoners started receiving more care. So they have the concept of rehabilitation, and the government around the world was introduced the concept of rehabilitation also. And also they consider the views on solitary confinement. Wars that engulfed the world in the beginning of 20th century brought the formation of large amounts of war prison camps and concentration camps. At this time in 20th century, they Some of the large prisoners or large number of prisoners were were have war prison camps and concentration camps. Most famous example of those types of prisons happened during the World War II, when Nazi government formed over 300 detention centers in which political opponents, Jews, gypsies, criminals, and others were detained without judicial process. So at this time, they there were 300 detention centers were Nazi government formed, and the political opponents, Jews, gypsies, criminals, and others were detained here without any judicial process. So, majority of them was eventually killed on an unprecedented massive scale that is today. So that's it. During the end of 20th century, modern prison system was finalized concept of probation. Service was introduced in 1991, and 3 years before that intended solely for the holding of inmates in permanent first prison isolation was formed. What is probation? So, Sanisha, probation is a privilege granted by the court to a person convicted for a criminal offense to remain in the community instead of actually going to prison or jail. So, in 1991, it was being introduced, the probation services. So, this is the privilege granted to the court to a person, which is he will be sent out of the community instead of being in jail and prison, but there will be an officer who will be the one who will be the one who will be follow up and provide the progress of the person. So she or he will be the one who will be follow up if a person doesn't do anything or he do any crime again. So those supermax prisons became widespread across the entire United States, with over 40 of them being active in the years 2005. Inmates in those prisons are held in a 23-hour long period of cell isolation with occasional communal yard time, work, educational programs, and meals in cafeterias. So at this time, which is the supermax prison became widespread, so the inmates of these prisons were held in 23-hour long periods of cell isolation with occasional communal yard time, work, educational programs, nested silay educational program, and also meals in cafeteria. So, as of 2006, it is estimated that over 9 million people are in prison. So, there were over 9 million, more than 9 million in 2006. So, worldwide in the with the United States leading in the rate of incarceration, which is 743 per 100,000 people. According to the published prison population numbers, the total worldwide prison population stand at 10.77 million. However, the total may will be excess of 11.5 million if numbers estimated to be held in detention centers in China and in prisons camp in North Korea are included. This was on December 2021. So let's go to the Philippines. So prisons population total including pre-trial detainees or remand prisoners, which is 1,065 165,583 at 31 at May 31, 2021, and 48,000 in Bucor prisons, 117,000 in BJMP jail. How many inmates are in the Philippines? So how many they are? The Philippines rank fifth among the largest size of prison population in Asia. So ikalima ang Pilipinas. That was approximately 200,000 inmates as of August 2022. Prison timeline. So let's go to the prison timeline. In 2nd century BC, records found that many Egyptian and Mesopotamian archaeological sites proved that existence of the earliest prisons in the world. 600 BC, the remain of the oldest known prison can be traced to the ancient room and their Carcerime Mamertino or Mamertine prison, originally designed as a cistern for water. This ancient prison was used for more than half millennia. One of its most famous prisoners was Gallic chieftain Vercingetorix. So he was executed at 46 BC. So in 200 AD, at the beginning of the new millennium, one of the oldest prison outside Roman Empire was found in the Israeli town of Tiberias. In 1166, English King Henry II commissioned the construction of first prison, together with new legal system that used concept of jury. In 1215, King John signed Magna Carta, which started a new age of legal system in England. This historic document stated that no man could be imprisoned without trial. In the 1400s, England established House of Correction, which houses a growing number of homeless people. In 1600s, growing number of English prisoners gave birth to the military pardon. So in 1700s, environment of industrial revolution and Napoleonic wars brought great increase in the number of incarcerated people in England. For the first time, empty ships were used to house prisoners. So in 1777, Englishman John Howard published influential book that proposed prison reform. 1786 to 1791, over 50,000 prisoners was transported from the England to the American continent, and after the start of War of Independence to penal colony of Australia. In 1779, Penitentiary Act included the concept of the rehabilitation to the UK prisons. 1791, philosophers Jeremy Bentham created design for his perfect prisons where government could spy on unknowing inmates. In 1815, for the first time in history, UK government started paying the wages of jailers and inspected conditions in prisons. In 1817, Elizabeth Fry fought for a prison reform solution of the problem of overcrowding women's imprisonment and children correction center. In 1829, Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia started enforcing solitary confinement in an effort to rehabilitate its prisoners. In 1835, prison inspectors first started working in UK together with the first prison volunteer teachers. In 1877, Prison Act brought all prisons under the rule of the UK government. 1890, great amounts of insane, suicidal, and catatonic prisoners brought some concerns to the legal system that enforced mandatory solitary confinement in U.S. prisons. In 1902, in this year, first reform school for delinquent boys is opened in Borstal, Kent. In 1934, American government opened Alcatraz prison for the nation's worst offenders. Located in the Bay of San Francisco, this famous prison became part of the American history. 1948 UK Criminal Justice Act created a model of all modern prisons. In 1983, this year marked the first occurrence of permanent lockdown mode in US prisons, 20-hour long periods of cell isolation with communal yard time for all inmates, work, educational programs, and meals in cafeteria. In 1989, Pelican Bay Prison in California was built for the sole purpose of holding inmates in isolation, thus becoming first supermax facility in the USA. In 1991, the Criminal Justice Act introduced the concept of probation service for all prisoners that serve the sentence that was longer than 12 months. 1993 modern UK prison serve was formed. In 2002, administration of the American President George W. Bush formed the famous Guantanamo Bay detention camp, which held many years suspects from war in Afghanistan, Iraq, and 9 over 11 terrorist incident. In the Philippines, or present time, 2018, the Philippines held the sixth highest prison population out of 21 Asian countries. As of 2019, the Philippines population rested at 108.31 million people, and 215,000 of those people were incarcerated. Therefore, the Philippines has an incarceration rate of about 200 per 100,000 citizens. There are 933 there are 933 prisons running in the Philippines. Unfortunately, they are mismanaged and overcrowded. There are five important facts about the incarceration system in the Philippines. So, the five facts about the Philippines incarceration system is: one is severe overcrowding, two pre-trial detainees, three vigilante justice, four high death tolls, and fifth is corruption. So the first one is severe overcrowding. Rodrigo Duterte won the presidential election in 2016. He promised to end crime within 6 months. This promise also included the killing of tens of thousands of criminals. Duterte's election led to the infamous war on drugs and eventually overcrowded prisons. Manila City Jail, the largest jail in the Philippines, is split into dorms that safely housed 170 inmates. So currently, these dorms housed around 500 people. Similarly, similarly, a room designated for 30 people holds about 130 in the Quezon City Jail. This severe overcrowding in prison leads to illness and death tolls in the thousands. So, at the year of 2016, Rodrigo Duterte won the president. So, we all know that Rodrigo Duterte fight against drugs and also criminality. By this one, the prisons were overcrowded. So, by that, the prisons leads to illness and death tolls in the thousands of prisoners. So pre-trial detainees. So according to the World Prison Brief, 75.1% of incarcerations within the Philippines incarceration system are pre-trial. So in 2018, 141,422 of 188,278 prisoners were pre-trial detainees. So there are many pre-trial detainees that they undergo due process that stayed in the prisons, and that also that also add a severe overcrowding of the prisons. Many people are serving sentences without conviction. Pre-trial detention is found in judicial system all over the world. In countries like the Philippines, people may serve time that outweighs their crime. On average, prisoners in the Philippines are detained for 9 months without being sentenced. So it is too long to stay in the jail for 9 months for to be convicted na. So vigilant justice. So Duterte's war on drugs escalated during his presidency. Jobless citizens were recruited to kill anyone suspected of dealing, buying, or using drugs. This was one of the few ways of some people to make money. Many homeless and impoverished people joined the war. So at this time, the vigilante justice, it is the time of Duterte's presidency, which is the people were the jobless people or citizens were hired to kill a criminal or users of drugs or pushers of drug, or some of them are the victims and suspected of dealing on it. So that's it, the vigilante justice. That there's no, some of them are being killed without being asked, or without being, or without any, or without any process of, or maybe they will be sent in the jail. So they will be killed by the vigilante. So some of the people also joined this for them to have money. So in 2016, Duterte told the public, so mani siya gingon, if you know of any addicts, go ahead and kill them yourself. Together, the Philippines police force and unidentified gunmen have killed 7,000 known drug dealers and users since the Duterte's presidency in 2016. So it's very alarming, the extrajudicial killings, also which also the Philippines war on drugs has created a belief that extrajudicial killings or extrajudicial violence and murder are necessary to fight crimes. But there's a human rights, not just human rights, all that. Well, Watch has turned the narrative around on the 30. They are publicizing information about the vigilante justice in the Philippines. So there's a rumors that there were vigilante also, that Duterte, that it was a friend of Duterte, and it will be the one who, they're the gunmen. So they're the unidentified gunmen that that helped kill this 7,000 known drug dealers. So next is high death tolls. About 5,200 inmates die annually at the New Bilibid prison. According to Ernesto Tamayo, the hospital medical chief, these deaths are due to overcrowding, dirty living conditions, and inmate violence. At 2019 Philippine Senate hearing, Tamay said that there were uncontrollable outbreaks of pulmonary tuberculosis. In addition to the overcrowding, poor living conditions, and inmate violence, New Bilibid prison lacks nutritional food and basic health care. On account of these living conditions, Tamayo report that at least one prison dies at NBP each day. Thankfully, politicians and prisons employees are working to reduce overcrowding in the Philippines prisons. Human rights advocates have also called for the release of vulnerable inmates, hoping to. So, at this time, at 2018, the New Bilibid prison were also the lack of the things that you will use in themselves, like the healthcare and also the nutritional food. So this lead to the increase of outbreaks of pulmonary tuberculosis. So high death toll sa mga to siya. Human rights advocate have also called for the release of vulnerable inmates, hoping to protect them from poor living conditions. So the next one is corruption. In August 2018, the public learned a former mayor may have been released from prison for good behavior. He was originally charged for rape and homicide in 1993. Similar stories of corruption in the Philippines prison continued to emerge. So, in 2018, there will be a public former mayor who will be released due to the good behavior. So, it was he was being charged by rape and homicide in 1993. In in September 2018, the public learned that a woman was told her husband's sentence would be shortened if she paid 50,000 pesos or 970 US dollar. Later that year, senators stated that inmates could live like kings for a fee. So, this information led to further allegations. Prison workers or officials were taking bribes to bring and distributing contrabands to inmates. So, in 2018, so there will also happened in the prisons, like there will be a person there where is high living person that live like kings. So they were being treated there like a king. They were not like a prison. They do what they want, and also they also pay for that. They pay for the person that is authorized in that area. And then the contraband in question included cigarettes, cell phone, and television. So they were being used cigarettes, which and cell phones and televisions, which is prohibited in the prison. So supposedly inmates can also pay for personal cooks and nurses. Inmates who cannot afford a better life within the prison are stuck in overcrowded and dirty rooms. These inmates have a higher rate of becoming ill and of death. Now that the corruption has been unearthed, officials are taking steps to weed it out, one prison at a time. So they do a koan. So some authorized person right now were eyed on this one, and they because of this there will be an inmates who will be do their personal cooks and nurses and used a place that is for them lang. So there will be a place also na will be overcrowded due to the dili dili siya equally distributed ang mga prisoners in the prison. So the next topic is all about the influence of the Roman Catholic Church, Pope John Paul the pro-life Pope. So kinsa ni siya o unsa ni siya. So the influence of Roman Catholic Church. The Roman Catholic Church is the largest group of Christian in the world. There are about 1 billion members, mostly in Europe, North and South America. The church goes back to about 30 AD to the life of Jesus Christ and his apostles. Roman Catholic believes that Jesus Christ is the Son of God and that he rose to heaven after being crucified. They believe that Jesus brought salvation to all people on earth. So that was the Roman Catholic Church belief. So the Roman Catholic Church has influenced history more than any other organization. It exercised its power throughout the Middle Ages. So missionaries traveled to other continents to spread Catholicism, so to spread words of God. So great architects created churches and cathedrals. Artists drew paintings and made frescoes. So that will be seen in the Catholic churches. Also here in our place in Philippines, in Dumaguete, in Cebu. That is the churches and cathedrals, which is there will be a paintings and also the mid frescoes. And religion's role in prison. Religion's value in prison is often about its contribution to the individual growth of development of a particular inmate. The focus is to perceived role of religion in helping lower the chances of recidivism among inmates. Other reasons, it focuses on the immediate value that religions have for inmates through their help in their coping and survival. So, the religion value in prisons was contribution to the individual growth or development. So, some of the prison right now have the religion group, which is they teach or they encourage inmates to go back in God, to be engaged in church. So one of some of them also being changed due to the words of God to be they enlightened the mind of the inmates that being prisoned there they that there were hopes and there will be the future belongs to them. And the influence and practice of religion of the correctional settings is as old as the history of prisons. Initial entry of religion into prisons was probably carried out by religious men who themselves were imprisoned. The Bible stories of such prisoners include Joseph and Jeremiah in the Old Testament and John the Baptist, Peter, John, and Paul in the New Testament. Beginning in the days of Constantine, the early Christian church granted asylum to criminals who would otherwise have been mutilated or killed. Although this custom was restricted in most countries by the 15th century, releasing prisoners during Easter time and request by church authorities to pardon or reduce sentence for offenders remained for centuries, with the latter still in existence in a modified form. Imprisonment under church jurisdiction became a substitute for corporal or capital punishment. In medieval times, the Roman Catholic Church developed penal techniques later used by secular states such as the monastic cell that serve as punishment place for criminal offenders. In 1583, the Protestant of Amsterdam built a house of correction for women, and one of men in 1603 in Rome, what are now the Sisters of the Good Shepherd, built correctional facilities for women, and in 1703, Pope Clement XI built the famous Michael Prison as a house of correction for younger offenders with with separation, silence, work, and prayer emphasized. So in 1593, there will be a Protestant that will build a house. So this house is a correction for younger offenders with separation, silence, work, and prayers emphasized. So as late as the 18th century, the Vatican prison still served as a model prison designed for Europe and America. Early settlers of North America brought with them the customs and common laws of England, including the pillory, the stocks, and the whipping post. During the 18th century, isolating offenders from fellow prisoners became the accepted correctional facilities or correctional practice. So, in early settlers of North America, custom and common laws of England, so it is include the pillory, the stocks, and the whipping post. So, in 18th century, isolating offenders from fellow prisoners became the accepted correctional facilities or correctional practice. So it was thought that long-term isolation combined with in-deep discussion with clergy, clergy would lead inmates to repent or become penitent, sorry, or being sorry for their sins. So there will be a discussion that will be let them realize that their sin and the that's it. That they will be sorry for their sins. So thus, the term penitentiary was derived. West Jersey and Pennsylvania Quakers were primarily responsible for many of the prison reforms. They developed the idea of substituting imprisonment for corporal punishment and combining the idea of the prison with a workhouse. The prototype of this regime was the Walnut Street Jail in Philadelphia that instead reflected the Quakers' beliefs in man's ability to reform through reflection and remorse. So, from this on, through the reflection, a man could change. Through our reflection, a man could have a hope that he will be changed and he will be sorry for his sin. And even during the 19th century, when daytime work was initiated by the Auburn system, solitary confinement at night was still the norm in correctional facility practice. The forced solitary confinement was true to serve the same repenting purpose as the older penitentiary. So, belief in education as a tool for reducing criminal activity also assisted in the growth of religion in prison because of the limited budget of corporal institutions. Chaplains were often called upon to be the sole educator in many American prisons. So, the schooling often consisted of chaplains standing in a dark corridor with a lantern hanging from the cell bars while extolling the virtues of repentance. So, at this time, at this 19th century, when daytime work was initiated by the Auburn system, so the belief in education as a tool for reducing criminal. So, education at this time was a tool in reducing criminal activity and also educate and also religion in prison. So volunteers also have a long history in the correction and that can be traced back to the beginning of prison. In the last 200 years, many religious groups have entered correctional facilities to provide religious service to the inmates. One of the most famous advocates for volunteers in correction was Maud Ballington Booth, the daughter-in-law of William Booth, who founded the Salvation Army. So up to now the religious services to inmates have already being implemented in some in some correctional facilities in our country. So they also they will be the prisoners or the inmates also being having the second chance for them to live again and for them to hope again, for them to go back to God. That's it. Today, volunteers are vital to religious programs, and without them, inmate participation would surely be limited. Faith representatives would be unable to minister to the large number and variety of inmates. So, many older correctional institutions are being refurbished or destroyed, replaced with facilities designed for better observation and security. Yet, the initial influence of religion, the philosophy, and the design of the penitentiary will surely remain in correctional history. So, in the religious program that also participated by the inmate will surely remain in correctional history and will always be happened in correctional in the Philippines right now. So, how Roman Catholic Church influenced prison system in the Philippines. So, how it is being influenced the prison system in our country. So, throughout the long history of corrections, religious persons and religious institutions have have greatly influenced the treatment of offenders. For centuries, churches were among the first institutions to provide asylum for accused criminals. The actual establishment of prisons and penitentiaries was a religious idea to that allowed the offender to obtain penance for his crimes, make amends, and convert while being isolated from others. But probably the most significant influence was the establishment of a regular chaplain. See, correctional chaplain were among the earliest paid non-custodial staff and were the first to provide education and counseling for inmates. Currently, many correctional inmates practice their religion on an individual basis or within the structure of an organized religious program. Religious programs are commonplace in jail and prisons, and research indicates that 1 in 3 inmates participates in some religious program during their incarceration. The influence and practice of religion in the correctional setting as old as the history of prisons, initial entry of religion into prisons was probably carried out by religious men who themselves were imprisoned. The Bible stories of such prisoners include Joseph and Jeremiah in the Old Testament and John the Baptist, Peter, John, and Paul in the New Testament. Beginning in in the days of the Constantine, the early Christian church granted asylum to criminals who would otherwise have been mutilated or killed. So, although this custom was restricted in most countries by the 15th century, releasing prisoners during Easter time and requests by church authorities to pardon or reduce sentences for offenders remained for centuries, with the later still in existence in a modified form. Imprisonment under church jurisdiction became a substitute for corporal or capital punishment. In medieval times, the Roman Catholic Church developed penal techniques later used by secular states, such as the monastic cell that served as a punishment place for criminal offenders. In 1583, the Protestant of Augustine built a house of correction for women and for men in 1603. In Rome, what are now the Sister of the Good Shepherd built correctional facilities for women, and in 1703, Pope Clementus XI built the famous Michael Prison was as house of correction for younger offenders with separation, silence, work, and prayer emphasized. As late as the 18th century, the Vatican prisons still serve as a model prison designed for Europe and America. In, in early settlers North America brought with them the customs and common laws of England, including the pillory of the stocks and the wiping post. So during the 18th century, isolating offenders from fellow prisoners became the accepted correctional facilities. It was thought that long-term isolation combined with in-depth discussion with clergy would lead inmates to repent or become penitent or sorry for their sin. Thus, the term penitentiary was derived. West Jersey and Pennsylvania queers were primarily responsible for many of the prison reforms. They developed the idea of substituting imprisonment for corporal punishment and combining the idea of prison with the workhouse. The prototype of this regime was the Walnut Street Jail in Philadelphia that is instead reflected the Quakers' believes in man's ability to reform through reflection. So a man will be reformed through reflection and remorse. So the next one is the Pope John Paul the pro-life Pope. So who is this one? Pope John Paul II, sometimes called Saint John Paul or John Paul the Great, born on 18 May 1920 and he died on April 2, 2005. He was the 264th Pope of the Catholic Church from 16th October from October 16, 1978 to his death in April 2, 2005. He was the second longest serving pope in history as a pope. He was the first non-Italian pope in 455 years. So, the Pope's statement, while the vast majority of U.S. Catholics supported capital punishment, Pope John Paul II has declared the Church near total opposition to the death penalty in his encyclical Evangelium Vitae, the Gospel of Life, so issued on March 25, 1995. After 4 years of consultations with the world's Roman Catholic bishops, John Paul II wrote that execution is only appropriate in cases of absolute necessity, in other words, when it would not be possible otherwise to defend society. Today, however, as a result of steady improvement in the organization of the penal system, such cases are very rare, if not practically non-existent. Until this encyclical, the death penalty was viewed as sometimes permissible as means of protecting society. The Universal Catechism, Book of Rules for Catholics, had affirmed the right of the state to punish criminal with appropriate penalties, not excluding in cases of extreme gravity the death penalty. So, death penalty was viewed as sometimes permissible as means of protecting society. So next one is the Walnut Street Jail. So this is the place where is the Walnut Street Jail was located. So it is also the first image. This is the image of Walnut Street Jail, and the next one is the map. So what is Walnut Street Jail and where it is located? So Walnut Street Jail or prison was a city jail and penitentiary house in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania from 1773 to 1838. Legislation calling for establishment of jail was passed in 1773 to relieve overcrowding in the High Street Jail. The first prisoners were admitted in 1776. It was located at 6th and Walnut Streets where it acquires its original name, Walnut Street Jail. That's So the penitentiary house built in 1790, it is considered to be the first in the United States as it was built to use individual cells and work details. The word penitentiary came from the Pennsylvania Quakers' belief in penitence and self-examination as a means to salvation. This was made a new and permanent form of combating crimes through the practice of the solitary confinement, which was later adopted at the Eastern State Penitentiary. The background of Walnut Street Jail is in 1773 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. A new jail was opened to receive the overcrowded prisoners of High Street Jail. It was located in Walnut Street on a lot bounded by Walnut Street 6 and Prince Street na locus where it acquires the name Walnut Street Jail. So, ako naman tong napakita kaniha ang kuan, yang map. So, the architecture is the jail was designed to hold groups of inmates in large rooms. It was designed by Robert Smith, a prominent Philadelphia architect. The building was in the typical U shape, designed to hold large number of inmates. There was little regard for their physical well-being and none for none for their rehabilitation. The prison was overcrowded and dirty, and inmates attack each other regularly. A new cell block called the Penitentiary House was added in 1790. So in 1790 there will be a cell block added which is the Penitentiary House. Then built within the country yard of the existing structure, it includes a series of small cells for individual prisoners. The cell and the corridors connecting them were arranged to prevent prisoners from communicating each other. So there will be a kaan, a corridors in cells that were arranged for them not to communicate with each other. So windows were high up. The cells had 9 foot high, 2.7 meters the ceiling. So and granted louvered to prevent prisoners from looking onto the street. Each cell had a mattress, a water tap, and a privy pipe. And as a penitentiary, solitary confinement was the goal, but such facilities were available for about a third of those admitted. Other prisoners were made to sleep naked in a common room. So, the success of the jail is the Walnut Street Jail. The Walnut Street Jail was to be converted into a penitentiary in 1790, but because of political reasons and the resistance of the jailer John Reynolds, the transformation did not occur till 1795. Penitentiary solitary confinement was the goal, but such facilities were only available for about a third of those admitted. Other prisoners were made to sleep naked in a common room. Overcrowding undermined the goal of solitary confinement of serious offenders, and more than one inmate was placed in each other. The isolation had a terrible psychological effect on inmates. Eventually, inmates were given in cell piecework on which they work up to 8 hours a day. Despite these difficulties, similar institutions were constructed in New York or Newgate in 1797, and New Jersey or Trenton in 1798. So the next topic is all about King Henry VIII. So King Henry VIII was born on June 28, 1491 in Greenwich, England, and died on January 28, 1547 at the age of 55 at London, England. So the title or office is King 1509 to 1547 in England. So house or dynasty is House of Tudor. So the notable family members is spouse Anne of Cleves, spouse Jane Seymour, spouse Catherine of Aragon, spouse Catherine Howard, spouse Anne Boleyn, spouse Catherine Parr, father Henry the Seventh, daughter Elizabeth I, daughter Mary I, son Edward VI, sister Mary Tudor, sister Margaret Tudor, and role in is Battle of Solent, Reformation, Act of Supremacy. So Henry VIII was the King of England from 1509 until his death in 1547. He is perhaps one of the England's most famous monarchs because he split England from the Roman Catholic Church and the Pope, and because he married 6 times. So he was married 6 times, and he split England from Roman Catholic Church and the Pope. And Henry also increased the power of the monarchy and government over the country. Many people he did not like were executed under his orders. So, including two of his own wives, he was easily led by whoever his favorite advisor was. Thomas Wolsey, Thomas More, Thomas Cromwell, Thomas Cranmer, and Richard Rich. More and Cromwell were also executed. He passed laws to merge Wales into England and was the first England monarch to be king of Ireland. And his government was able to raise more money because they stopped paying money to the Roman Catholic Church and because they closed down the monasteries, but he also spent far more money on his own enjoyment, not achievement, not achieve much. He made the Royal Navy much bigger and made other improvements to the armed forces. So early in his reign, he was seen as a handsome young man. So in his early ages, he was so early in his reign, he was seen as as a handsome young man who had stupid a lot and enjoyed sports, music, and later in his reign, he became weak, ill, and hugely obese. He also became unpredictable, bad temper, and unable to admit to making mistakes. He did at the age of 55 in 1547. The next king was his son Edward VI. So Henry was born of Greenwich Palace on June 28, 1491, and was the son of Henry VII of England and Elizabeth of York. He was one of the seven children. Four of them survived infancy: Arthur, Prince of Wales, Margaret, Henry, and Mary. He had his own servants and minstrel, including a full name John Goss. He even had a wiping boy who was punished for Henry when he did something wrong. Prince Henry enjoyed music and Justine was very good at both of them. At the age of 10, he could play many instruments, including the fife, harp, viola, and drums. Henry was scholar, linguist, musician, and athlete at his early age. He could speak fluent Latin, French, and Spanish. He had the best tutors and he also had to learn jousting, archery, hunting, and other military arts. Henry was very religious also. So at his very young age, he plays more instrument and also he also speak fluent Latin, English, and Latin, French, and Spanish. So Henry's older brother Arthur was the heir to the throne. This means he would have become the king when Henry VII died. Arthur married a Spanish princess, Catherine of Aragon. Her name in Spanish was Catalina de Aragon. Prince Arthur died a few months later. He was 15 years old and Henry was 10 years old. After his brother died, Henry was heir to the throne. So Arthur died and then Henry, as a 10 years old, was the heir to the throne. While his father was alive, he was watched closely because the king feared for the safety of his only remaining male heir. Henry could go out only through a private door. And then he was watched by specially appointed people. No one could speak to Henry. So no one can speak to Henry. He spent most of his time in his bedroom, which could only be entered by through his father's bedroom. So Henry was being stuck in his room, and only the entrance will be the door of his father's bedroom. Henry never spoke in public unless it was to answer a question from his father. He kept an enthusiastic personality under control on the public occasions because he feared his father's temper. He was given little training for his future role as king by his father and relied heavily on his counselor in the early years of his reign. In 1509, Henry VII died of the tuberculosis as well, and his son became King Henry. He was 17 years old. So Henry became the king when he was only 17 years old because his father died due to the tuberculosis. And the early years of Henry is 3 months after becoming king. Henry married Catherine of Aragon. They tried to have children as Henry wanted a son who could be the next king. In 1511, she gave birth to a son who they named Henry, but he died 7 weeks later. She later gave birth to a girl, the future Queen Mary I. One. All her other children were stillborn died before birth. He died have one son, Henry Pridzoy, through a woman he was not married to. This son could not become king. Early on, Henry had two of his father's advisors executed. They were not popular, and Henry claimed they had been stealing from the money they had been looking after. Henry would often execute anyone he did not like during his race of his reign. So Henry was also sometimes brutal, but also care for his nation. So because Henry claimed they had been stealing from the money, so he executed two of his father's advisors. So that's it. So from 1514, Thomas Wolsey became an important advisor to Henry. Wolsey helped Henry changed. Wolsey later became a cardinal, making him an important figure in the church. At first, Henry wanted to be friends with the King of France, but soon he instead joined with Spain. The Pope and the Holy Roman Empire. To weaken France, he dreamed of gaining more lands in France. The result were mixed. England won some battles against France in 1513. The alliance weakened France's power over the Pope. Scotland invaded England in 1514 but lost badly at the Battle of the Flodden. But Henry spent a lot of money and did not gain much land. So, in 1520, an event named the Field of the Cloth of Gold took place in Calais. At the time, the city was part of England rather than France. It was held to celebrate peace between France and England because they had been at war for a long time. Loads more of money was spent on it. People enjoyed music, dancing, food, wine, and culture for 2.5 weeks. Henry famously wrestled King Francis I of France and lost. Despite this, England and France were soon fighting again. After they signed a treaty in 1525, there was less fighting. So in 1525, after the signed treaty, there were less fighting. So the split with Rome. So the most important event that happened in England when Henry was the king was the country's change in religion. At first, there was no sign that Henry would do this. 8 years into Henry's reign, the Protestant Reformation began in Germany. Until then, Western Europe had been part of the Roman Catholic Church. When the Reformation began, some countries broke away from the Roman Catholic Church to form Protestant churches. At first, Henry was against this. The Reformation did not spread to England straight away, but by the 1530s, there were many powerful people in England who liked the idea of Reformation. Henry became desperate to have a son by 1527. Henry was wanting divorce Catherine and Mary Anne Boleyn. The Roman Catholic Church said he could not divorce without asking the Pope. Henry asked the Pope, but the Pope would not do this. The Pope said it went against the teachings of the Church. Henry blamed Wolsey for failing to change the Pope's mind. He sacked Wolsey and ordered him to be put on trial, though Wolsey died before the trial could happen. After that, Thomas More became his main advisor, but More opposed the divorce, so he was replaced a few years later by Thomas Cromwell. Henry also chose a man called Thomas Cranmer to be the Archbishop of Canterbury. Henry knew that Cranmer would do what he wanted, and Cranmer agreed that Henry could have a divorce from Catherine. The Pope did not know this, so he let Cranmer become the Archbishop. So anything would happen in Henry because he is a powerful and makapangyarihan. And also, he will kick the one who will also be the reason for the things that will not happen to him. So he changed his advisor everything that if the advisor didn't support or oppose the decision of him, so he will oppose that. So he will change that one. So anyone who will oppose will be changed. So a powerful ruler might have forced the Pope to change his mind, but the most powerful rulers would have opposed the divorce. Catherine's nephew was Charles V, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. And Catherine came from Spain, the largest Catholic country, in 1534. Attempts to reach an agreement over divorce failed. Henry asked Parliament to pass the Act of Supremacy, which meant that the king, not the Pope, was the head of the church in England. This created a new Church of England. The Pope was so angry that he excommunicated Henry, meaning Henry was thrown out of the church. Henry then forced all priests and bishops to accept him as the new leader. Anyone who refused was punished. So anyone who refused was punished, and anyone who opposed will be changed. Among those killed were Thomas More and his old teacher John Fisher. So Henry was not a true Protestant. He wanted the church. He wanted the church. He wanted the Church of England to be similar to the Roman Catholic Church, but under his control, some Protestants were even executed, including Anne Askew. However, Henry was easily led by people like Thomas Cranmer, and Anne Boleyn, who secretly wanted the country to become Protestant. It was not until the reign of Edward VI and Elizabeth I that the Church of England became fully Protestant. Henry and Cromwell thought that monasteries in which Roman Catholic monks and nuns lived had more money and land than the monks and nuns needed. Henry forced the monks and nuns to move out of the monasteries. Then Henry gave their money and land to men who supported him. Most of the men who received money and land from the closed monasteries were Protestants. This event was called the dissolution of the monasteries. So Henry and Cromwell thought that monasteries in which Catholic monks live. So Henry forced monks and nuns to move out for him to give the area to the people who supported him. So that was Henry's power to do. So he was, for me, he was also a little bit brutal. So after his divorce from Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII married Anne Boleyn, who was younger than Catherine and still able to have children. Henry soon became unhappy with the marriage. He and Anne did not get on well as they had before they married. Anne had many enemies in the government, including Henry's most loyal minister, Thomas Cromwell. Henry was also unhappy that Anne, just like Catherine, only had a daughter and no sons. Henry started looking for another wife. So Henry was married again to Anne and divorced Catherine. So Anne doesn't have a daughter, doesn't have a son, only a daughter. So he decided again to marry another wife. In January 1536, Henry fell off a horse while jousting and was badly injured. He took a long time to wake up and his leg was wounded. The wound never properly healed and he had painful ulcers on his leg for the rest of his life. This meant it was hard for him to do exercise. So after he started to become obese. The head injury may have also caused him to become more bad tempered. So he was a bad temper, but due to the injury, he will become more bad tempered. Also, he became more obese due to the injury happened to him, and also he cannot do exercise. So later that year, Cromwell helped Henry to find a way to get rid of Anne by finding people who said that she had been the lover of several other men. Anne was put on trial and found guilty, and she was executed by having her head chopped off by a French swordsman. So Anne was executed and Anne was put on trial and executed because he found guilty by finding people who said that he had been a lover of several other men. Then he have a head chopped off by French swordsman. Henry's third wife was Jane Seymour. She soon gave birth of a son called Edward. Although this made Henry very happy, a few days later Jane died. Henry had loved her very much, and he never got over his sadness at her death. He lost interest in everything and became bigger in size. He became angry with Thomas Carmelo when Carmelo suggested that he should get married again after Jane's death. So his third wife, Jane Seymour, so maybe he fell in love with this girl, and he had a son called Edward, but Jane died after a few days later. Then he became more angry, and Thomas Cromwell suggested that she should get married again after Jane's death, but that idea makes him more angry. After a while, Henry changed his mind. As he still only had one son, he realized that it might be a good idea to marry again. And he agreed to marry Anne of Cleves, a German princess. When Anne arrived, Henry did not think she was as pretty as she looked in the pictures he had seen, and he was not satisfied with her. Anne was also unhappy and agreed to be divorced from Henry after only a few months. Cromwell had helped arrange the marriage. Henry was angry with Cromwell and had him executed. In the meantime, Henry had noticed a young lady at court called Catherine Howard and thought that she might make a good wife. Catherine Howard was a cousin of Henry's second wife, Anne Boleyn. Henry and Catherine got married in 1540, but Catherine was much younger than Henry, and she soon got tired of him and started to flirt with other men. After they had been married for just over a year, Henry found out that Catherine had been having an affair with someone else. She was found guilty of treason and was executed just like Anne Boleyn he had been a few years before. So also Catherine Howard was executed due to the affair of someone else's man. Henry's sixth and last wife was called Catherine Parr. She was a woman in her 30s who had already been married twice. Her first two husbands had been much older than she was, and both had died. Henry thought that she would be more sensible and faithful than his other wives, and turned out to be right. Catherine Parr stayed married to Henry for over 3 years until he died, but they did not have any children, maybe due to the age. After divorcing Catherine of Aragon, Henry began to suffer many different ailments. He never again regained health. He died on 28 January 1547 at the age of 55 and was buried in Windsor Castle. Henry was the father of two queens and one king. They were Mary I of England, Elizabeth I of England, and Edward VI of England. None of them had any children of their own. In 1536, the Act of Union was passed under Henry's rule, which had a long-lasting effect on Wales as nation, and the Act of Union meant that Welsh people were forced to speak English, and things such as road signs were translated into English. The royal family, who were based in London, were now officially in charge of Wales. However, the act of the act also meant that Welsh citizens were given the same legal rights as the English, so there was an upside to this new law. The personality of Henry is Henry often liked to be captured in his portraits with either food or pets. He had many pets. Henry was often seen with his dog. He owned a white pug and was very aware of how much his dog represented him as a wealthy man. Henry VIII spent a lot of time at magnificent building named Hampton Court Palace that belonged to his friend Cardinal Thomas Wolsey. After falling out with Wolsey, Henry took the palace for himself. He made the palace far larger, building things such as tennis court and jousting yards. The next one is King Edward VI, a jewel king of Henry. So, Edward VI is born on October 12, 1537, and died on July 6, 1553. He was King of England and Ireland from 20 from January 28 to 1547 until his death on July 6 on 1553. Edward was the son of Henry of England and Jane Seymour. His mother died 12 days after his birth. He became king at the age of 9 when his father died, although he had two older sisters, Mary and Elizabeth. Edward was the next in line for the throne because he was male. Because he was such a young king, the country was governed by nobles. He had two advisors or regents. The first was his uncle Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, who became Lord Protector. For the first 2.5 years of Edward's reign, Lord Somerset advised and guided the young king. Somerset was then replaced by John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. Edward was the first Protestant king of England, although his father Henry had broken the Church of England away from Roman Catholic Church. He had not changed much else. Most of the major most of the major changes to the Church of England happened during Edward's reign. They were led by Somerset, Northumberland, and Archbishop Thomas Cranmer. Also during the reign, England tried to take over Scotland after a good start. It ended in defeat. His reign also saw economic problems and unrest. He died when he was 15.5 years old, probably from tuberculosis. Before he died, Edward named his cousin Lady Jane Grey as his heir and excluded his half-sister Mary and Elizabeth. He was trying to prevent Mary, a Catholic, from returning the country to Catholicism. However, Mary overthrew Jane less than 2 weeks later and became the queen. Mary undid the reform of Edward's reign, but Elizabeth restored them in 1559. Religious changes. Laws were passed to make churches more plain. Catholic churches were rich in decorations and color. Now, under Edward, stained glass windows and icons were removed from churches. The furniture within churches became very basic and plain. The actual service became more plain, and the common person could not could now understand what was being said at services, now called Holy Communion, were in English rather than Latin. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer wrote the Book of Common Prayer also in English. Priests did not have to dress in the bright clothing associated with the Catholic Church, and under Edward, they were also allowed to marry. The king remained as head of the church. All of these changes were a major break from the tradition of the Catholic Church in part of Germany and Switzerland. Religious group had also broken away and protested against the wealth and corruption of the Catholic Church. They became known as Protestant, and England under Edward became a Protestant country with an independent Church of England. So, so Edward had never been a healthy boy, and his health failed in 1553. After the 9-day reign of Lady Jane Grey, his Catholic half-sister Mary became Queen of England, and the country went through another period of religious changes. So Edward is not a healthy boy, so his health failed in 1553. Then Lady Jane, and then also his half-sister Mary became Queen of England. Then prison have four major purposes. So these purposes are retribution, incapacitation, deterrence, and rehabilitation. Retribution means punishment for crimes against society. Depriving criminals of the freedom is a way of making them pay a debt to society for their crimes. So this topic will be tackled in next video. So thank you for watching.